Welcome, everybody. This is Hugh Massie, the Executive Chairman and Founder at DNA Behaviour International. And today I'm delighted to be hosting another one of our identity conversations. And I have the great pleasure to have with me Keita Demming, who is a coach and a thought partner at the Covenant Group in Toronto, Canada. And Keita does a lot of work in designing the leadership development, performance programs for all of the Covenant clients. And I've also had the great fortune to work with and collaborate with Norm Trainer, who Keita works with day in, day out. So welcome, Keita.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so let's get started. So Keita, why don't you tell us a little bit about your life background, career background, and how you've got to this place of being a thought partner at the Covenant Group.
Yeah, I think I always tell people I have a non-linear path that also lacks discipline. And the reason I say that is because when I did my undergraduate degree, I did an interdisciplinary undergraduate degree, which was a combination of computer science, linguistics, philosophy, and psychology, which meant I've never been steeped in one discipline really. And then my PhD was in adult education, which again was interdisciplinary. And my master's work was organizational change, which again is interdisciplinary. So that's why I tell people I lack discipline. But it's a bit of a pun on that. I think what people need to know about me, linear-wise, is I grew up in Trinidad and Tobago with parents who, I would say they were progressive, might be a word, but they were different. They raised my brother and I to really think on our own, which in the Caribbean school system is not necessarily a good idea, because then you end up bucking up against the system. So I'll give you a small example. I was in a religious knowledge class one time, and the teacher, there was a line in the text that said, "If ever you question God's existence, you're damned to hell." And I said, "I have a question. How come in all the other classes you ask us, you tell us to question everything, but in this class, we can't question the existence of God?" I ended up in detention. So my whole life, that in many ways in my whole life, I've been taught to think independently and ask difficult questions. And that's partly how my parents brought me up. Like my dad had this thing where these are the rules in the house. These are the reasons for them. If you come up with a better reason, we'll change the rule. So I've always been in that kind of endeavor. And my mom, she started a corporate communications company in our house. So she's been in communications for a while. And I often tell people I had a career in communications, and then I went to university. I was in my early 20s when I went to university. I went to university late because I also didn't finish high school. So I had to go and finish high school, do a high school diploma, and then go to university, etc. But the reason I tell you the communications piece is that when I was doing my master's, I landed on some things of like, how do we make change happen? How do we change people? How do we change countries? How do we change the world? How do we make the world a better place? And in general, it happens at 3 levels. It happens at the micro, the meso, and the meta level. That's kind of how it happens. And we have to work at all of those 3 levels. So I was really fascinated by how do we make change happen? And I was reading, my approach to it was look at all the organizational change literature, because I was thinking about how do we make change in organizations. And my master's thesis, for which I got an award, the best thesis of the year out of 400 students, I basically looked at organizational change theory, mapped them on a grid, and said, which ones do the stories that people who've just gone through organizational change, which ones does it match? And what I came across some literature that talked about how traditionally we've described organizations as machines, and we should be describing organizations as conversations. Because if we change the conversation in organizations, we transform the organization, we create organizational change by changing the organizations. Now, this is years after having already done peer-to-peer coaching programs, having worked in my mom's company and communications, etc. So for me, I've kind of come full circle now where I really believe everything comes down to better conversations. How do you and I have a better conversation around a particular topic so we can have a particular impact and we can make a particular difference in the world? And it just happens that I'm a coach. I use conversations to do that. And then we have different tools, etc. Because I think, and my wife bought me the domain all about conversations. She's like, you need to just stop talking about conversations, because I think at the crux of it, I'm really interested in how do we use conversations to make a difference, to get more of what we want in our world. So that would be a little bit about my background.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And just tell me one other thing, before I'm going to mine back into that, Keita. You also did something pretty significant there in Trinidad around TEDx.
Right. Yeah.
And so what happened with that? I think this is important to draw out, and maybe it's related to changing conversations as well.
So yeah, it actually is. When I finished my master's, I wanted to do something that was a big project that, given the skills I had at the time, I would have likely failed. That was the mission. So I decided to embark on TEDx Boston. I figured this is the time to do something. You've finished your master's, you don't have kids, you're not married, like do something big that you might fail at. Yeah. So I started TEDx Port of Spain, and the first year, the theme was, give you two guesses what the first theme was, my friend.
Changing conversations.
100%. The first year's theme was changing conversations.
And I didn't know the answer to that. but I suppose I've learned to become a good listener.
Exactly. So the first year, the theme was changing conversation. And my thesis was, in a country of 1.3 million people, it only takes about 100 or 1,000 people to make a big difference in that island. So if we could use the TEDx platform as a way of injecting ideas into the island, we could probably have a big impact on the island. That TEDx, we were punching well above our weight class. Of the 18,000 TEDx events around the world, we were ranked in the top 1%. We have 4 million views online. TED sent representatives to try and figure out how we were producing such good talks down there. We were one of 5 TEDx events to partner with TED in 2020 around TED Women. So we did an amazing job. Like, we did that for 10 years. The pandemic sort of killed the momentum on that, and we're rethinking that. But the theme on that was always, how do we make this better through conversation? How do we change the conversations on a particular island? And it ended up being really successful. Depending on how you measure success, like, we were successful on many metrics, and then we weren't successful on other metrics. But undoubtedly, we built this community over a 10-year period where people were thinking about ideas that can transform an island. So yeah, that is another piece where I believed that was an event where it said, like, we got to use this platform to try and figure out how we change conversations in the island. So yeah,
I'm glad I asked that question, just to find out more about it, because about what you did with TEDx there, in Trinidad and Tobago, because clearly it had a huge impact and was very successful. So coming forward, how do we have better conversations? How do you change the conversation to create this sustainable change?
So I think there are a couple of ways to answer that, but I think number one, people have to. So if you want to run a 10K, for example, what are some of the things you would start to do to prepare for that? Okay, just give me an example.
I would start out with some. If I was going to do that, I was going to start with some longer runs, but not completely at the 10K level. But I would build myself up progressively. I would be looking at my nutrition so that I have the kind of strength to get there. I'd have to look at actually my own physiology and what changes do I need to make in that to even know that I could do it, and then be working on my mindset, because I might have to go through a pain barrier. So I see that, as much of being successful with the 10K run is not just physiologically can you do it, you have to be in the right shape, but my mindset as well. I think that would be something that's important to do. So there would be some of the areas I'd start to work on, how I hydrate myself, the practices around that, because you can't start out thirsty, right? So
yeah. So let's translate some of that to conversation, right? So if you want to have a better conversation, what are some of the things you have to do to prepare to have that conversations? And I'm going to use your running metaphor. Number one, we have to be intentional about how we enter a conversation. We have to be intentional about like how we design a conversation. Most of us go into conversations ad hoc. We're making it up as we go along because we do it so often and we take it for granted. But we don't practice our skills around conversation. That's one. You don't think about the component parts that go into a conversation. So each conversation has an arc. Conversations don't end, but we think about them as ending. They linger. Like I had a conversation with a parent yesterday about getting our kids ready for September. And I've been thinking about that conversation since, right? Conversations sort of linger. We have to think about that. We have to think about what are some of the tools or things that so what's the equivalent of nutrition and long runs in a conversation. A big tool in conversation is how do you ask better questions? How do you listen better? Most of us are not very good listeners. Most of us have been taught I forget what it's called, but it's like that listening. There's a thing that they call it. Anyway, there's a listening term that most of us have been taught, and it's basically reflect what the person says, etc. Active listening. Yeah, most of it has been taught active listening. But active listening is like the surface level of listening. What you want to be listening to is what does the person want? What's that person saying they want more of? So even how you listen is part of how you build that better conversation. So in the same way that you prepare for that 10K, there are ways in which you can prepare for a conversation that makes that conversation 10 times better and leads you in a whole different direction. Even the most antagonistic of conversations can do that for you. Like but most people do not think about the full arc or potential of a conversation. So your audience might be most interested in a sale, for example. So how do you enter into a sale? We would argue that you want to design that conversation so that you help the other person get what they want. But you have to be very intentional about each part of that design. But most people are going into that and making it up every time. So for example, if I enter on a sales conversation, the first question I ask is, Hugh, what would make this call valuable for you? First question I always ask. And I'm following 2 rules. Focus on the other person, earn the right to pursue.
Yeah, so it's putting the other person, if you're the interviewer, it's putting the other person at the center of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you haven't quite said the word, but what I'm going to ask you about it is, in a way, you're mining for their motivation. What's the deeper part in there that might make them to change? What chord do you need to hit? I know, I suppose if I put it this way, I know when I've made any significant change in my life, it has come from someone asking me a question, and it struck my passion and purpose in some way. That's got me to, even if I wasn't completely aware of it, that it's hit an emotional chord that then says, okay, I now need to think about this differently and take ownership. Does that make sense? So I agree. I've very on board with the question approach. It's questions.
So let me break this down a bit for you. So take the word question and you break it apart. It's got the word quest in there. Questions take you on a quest. They take you on a journey.
Yeah.
We don't think about it like that. We don't think about, okay, so for example, you and I have a conversation now. I have 50% of control of where the conversation goes next.
Yeah, he who has to ask the questions has the power.
Oh, yeah, but even not even that. Conversations are role taking. So whenever you speak, you start talking, I have 50% of the chance to take the conversation in a different direction.
Yep.
I get to choose where the conversation goes next. So I have to step into my power, which goes into the other piece that you talk about in your running, which is mindset. I have to have a particular mindset entering the conversation for me to, what's the goal of my conversation? If my goal of that conversation is to have a better conversation versus I'm going into that conversation to win the argument versus I'm going into that conversation to make a sale. How about I just go into, let's go in with the purpose, sole purpose of making it a better conversation, however you define that. Helping the person get more of what they want. Just that switch makes a massive difference in the way you interact with people, because what I've come to believe really strongly is that, and I think the evidence is there, is we cannot accomplish anything in life, nothing, without conversations.
Yeah.
You can't do anything. Like if I'm going to your conference, like I gotta have conversations with a bunch of people to get there, including a flight, like my airline people, right? So there's a whole bunch of things to. And then speaking to what you talked about is like when somebody's asked you a question, one of the most powerful models that we've come up with is you have conversations at 3 levels. Conversations with yourself, conversations with your inner circle. So those are your family, friends, loved ones, your trusted circle. And then conversations with your industry or sector, that conversations outside of that. Those are larger conversations. And then most of us have to hold some kind of stage with that conversation. And when we want to make changes, so for example, if you made a significant change in your life, you got to have conversations at all 3 of those levels at the same time with different success rates, right?
Yeah.
But what if you could have better conversations at each 3 of those levels? What does that do to the trajectory of your life? It changes everything.
Yeah.
But not many of us are very intentional about how we show up for those conversations, right? So yeah, so I think that's what people often miss in this very simple thing that we do every day around conversations.
So you guys at Covenant, and you are, along with Norm and others on the team, you know, you're a coach, and I know you do a lot of work with financial advisors, insurance agents, leaders, particularly in the financial services industry. So, you know, what are you saying to them about having better conversations?
Oh, all kinds of, we've just launched this whole thing around conversational selling, but the number one thing I think that if you could do one thing that would transform your relationships with the clients is to design your conversations before you go into it. And I'll give you an example. I had a client recently who had this really, really big case, and it went sideways because of a bunch of unfortunate events. So he and I met 2 days before that conversation and designed how that conversation was going to go. And when his anxiety was like, before our conversation, he had no idea what he was going to do, and it just felt lost. And I said, and he just felt lost. I said, look, if your only goal to go into that conversation and make the situation better, versus your goal is to go into that conversation and try to resolve this very complex issue. That's all you want to do. In each step of that conversation, take it to a better place. That's it. And he said, when he came out of that, he's like, man, that conversation, he called me soon after. I was like, that conversation went better than I can imagine. The client was so happy, etc. And we followed the 2 rules: focus on the other person and the right to proceed. I really believe we have to understand that conversations have an arc. And if we bring intentionality to that conversation, it can be absolutely transformative in even the most difficult circumstances. There are a few things we have to teach you. For example, you can never change somebody's mind. People, like, that's a mindset thing.
Yeah.
People change their own minds. So the most you can do is plant the seed for change and walk people up to like a fork in the road and then let them make the choice. But anytime I start to talk about conversations, first thing people ask, Keita, how do I change people's mind? Like you can't. That's an impossible task. But what you can do is ask them questions and get them to change their own mind. And that is a like that people really struggle with that. So yeah.
Yeah, and often their mind is made up based on a false perception or some other belief or feeling at the time. And sometimes I think if you can ask them the right question in the right way and get them to think about an issue differently, as you say, they might start to change their mind and own a decision.
So I would say the false perception thing is tricky, because in your mind it's a false perception. In their mind, it's absolute truth.
Yeah.
Right. So what our natural place to do is try and tell them our truth. Versus if you would have more luck spending time in questioning their truths and demonstrating to them how their truths have some holes, rather without even telling them what you believe. So I'll give you an example. And I'm hesitant to give this example, but I'm going to give it anyway. We had a client, we're based in Canada, we're based in Toronto. We had a client, big client, he's from the US, very, very big Trump fan. So he came to us about 3 months after Trump had been elected, and he was so excited. I can't wait for Trump to make America great again. And that's what he was talking about. And we're walking from our office to lunch, etc. And he's talking about us. And I said, look, before we have lunch, I have one question for you. What year was America great? And he said 1950. And Norm was like, what are you talking about? 1950, the tax rate was between 80 and 95%. This is what's happening. I said, no, I don't even want to go there. I just want to ask you a question. You can obviously see that I'm a black male. Is that a fair thing? He's like, yeah, what are you talking about? Of course. What do you think 1950s was like for somebody like me? He's like, it was awful. It was like, this was happening. There was the civil rights, etc. Like, so let me ask you a question again. What year was America great? And he was like, yo, I never thought about that, etc. And then he was like, wow, I got to think about it. And then he was like, yo, you really stumped me with that. What year was America great? But he was on this thing of, I'm up to now, I have not told him what I believe, what I think, etc. I just asked him, what year was America great? And I said, was America great for somebody like me, who you know, like, and trust? And it completely changed. I never told him what to think, etc. And up to this day, that client comes and tells me, he's like, Keith, that was one of the most powerful things you ever taught me.
I think it is very powerful, and it does that gets a lot of deep thought without going.
But listen to what I said. He says that was the most powerful thing you ever taught me. I didn't teach him anything.
Yeah.
All I did was ask him 2 questions.
He taught himself.
Exactly. He changed his own mind. Whereas the default is for us to get into an argument about, well, America wasn't great in 1950s. Irrelevant, like waste of time. You know what I mean?
But in a way, what we're talking about with with the question asking and using that to change conversations is guiding people to self-discovery in some ways for themselves. That's how I've always seen it. And in some ways, what we've tried to do at DNA Behavior in teaching advisors some of this, maybe not at the depth that you do, because you've taught me a lot today, but it's the communication's got to be right. You've got to create the right environment for each person. The setting for each person to have these conversations is different. Some like it a little more formalized, others more casual. That's, and the words that get used, the same question could be asked, but for one person is asked in one particular way and another a different way. That's how I have approached these things. If I said I was going to be intentional at helping a client, coaching a client, guiding them, that's where I've always been intentional, was about customizing that experience. What happens thereafter is a different matter. But it is, it's interesting. So Keita, just tell me a little bit, let's just sort of explore your own DNA style for a moment, because, you're what we call an initiator. You're fairly driven. like to work independently. You're a man of your own mind. But sitting in there is you've got this extreme creativity. You're an innovator. So I think we probably guessed in some ways how that comes out, but just talk already from today, but just talk about how you use your innovation, how it's been a strength for you. If you're not working in an innovative environment, being the thought partner, does that cause you stress? So just talk a little bit about that for a moment.
I think first I had to become aware that I was creative, for example. So
yeah,
all of my life has led me towards doing things that were different. Like I was always like, this doesn't make sense, I'm going to do it this way. This doesn't make sense, I'm going to do it this way. My challenge is I always thought of creativity as dance, art, those kind of things. And those things, number one, I grew up in the Caribbean where there was no art classes. If I told my mom I want to be a musician, that's a crazy idea. Like I need to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer. That was my options. Like there's certain things that weren't fostered, but I think my creativity couldn't hide. It just came out. And the creativity has come in the form of education, creating workshops, etc. So one of the first awards I ever got was when I was in university. I designed some workshops for students, and one of the staff that was there was like, that was one of the most creative workshops I've ever seen. And there's a workshop where, this is long before meditation was a thing. I got people to lie down and meditate, and I them to chew a raisin, and I did this whole and she was like, I've never, you know what I mean? And this is before people were talking about like mindfulness and all that. So I think I had to kind of discover and then accept that I was creative, because the world had sort of taught me that I wasn't. There were a certain bunch of indicators that taught me, hey, you're not creative. And then I've come to realize, well, partly through doing DNA behavior, partly through looking at the trajectory of my life, where I've realized, hey, you've been creative in all kinds of ways. So for example, I once did a move in rugby that people were like, Keita, that was an amazing move. I'm not recognizing that was part of my creativity, as part of my innovation. I've always been driven towards like, how do we make this better? How do we do change? That's why I did a master's in organizational change. And then at the end of my thesis, the piece that I found lacking was a theme that had come up called learning. And then I ended up doing a master's in adult education, because I was like, okay, I got to get this learning piece down, because change has something to do with learning. And at that point, I'd already landed on conversation. So how do we learn through conversations? How do we change the conversations we have at those three levels, ourselves, with people in our social circle, and the systems we're in? So I think the creativity was always there. For a bunch of reasons, I hadn't yet discovered it. And I also hadn't been in an environment where it was allowed to foster.
Yeah.
So moving from Trinidad, where I was a terrible student, didn't finish high school, and then going into university in Vancouver, University of British Columbia, where, let me show you how amazing I think this university is. If there was a course you wanted to take and the university didn't offer it, and you had the grades, you could teach that course. So I taught the first positive psychology course at the University of British Columbia, because I wanted to take the course and there was no course. And they had this program that I had to apply for. I had to get a professor to sponsor it. And me and 12 other students went through this course that we co-designed, called positive psychology.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, but that environment fostered my learning. That environment fostered my creativity. Before that, I was not very smart. I had one teacher who once told me, Keita, focus on football. Academics is not your thing. Today I have a PhD.
Yeah.
Technically, I'm a high school dropout. Today I have a PhD. It was because that environment just wasn't allowing me to find things that I was interested in. So yeah.
And I've having done these conversations with lots of people, and been working in the human behavior space, for 20 plus years now. I've heard that in different ways quite a lot of times that very creative kids have a lot of problems at school, and some of it just comes out from being bored, not connecting to the ideas that are, the information that's being conveyed. You in a way, you're working on something else. You're wanting to challenge the status quo, which I think something you talked about at the start, and you're not allowed to. In a way, you had parents that said you could if you come up with a better idea. That would have been encouraging creativity, but at another level, it's being shut down. E.g., even with the God question, it's it's getting. The point is getting into the right environment where you can flourish, I think, is a big part of this.
But then you end up with the paradox of like having a home where the creativity is encouraged, and then when I go to school, it's like, what do you like? How dare you have a different idea? So
yeah.
One is designed for compliance, and the other one is like, okay, how do we teach you to make good choices, right? And I think those are two very different things. And in general, school is designed to teach us to comply, and that did not work for me, and I would argue it doesn't work for a lot of kids. So it's a tough space, right?
Yeah, well, I think this is, I really appreciate your candor today, and we've learned a lot about you. So how do you see your identity in the future? Keita Demming, you're really a very highly accomplished man academically. Forget the high school dropout bit.
Yeah.
You're highly accomplished. You're coaching, guiding, leading a lot of people now. Norm is a thought leader as well. You guys there are leaders in this space of change. But what's that higher place of being for you? How would you describe that?
Well, for one, I'm still learning and discovering that. For one thing.
Yeah, it's an evolving thing. But if you said, what do I want my identity to be, and people are going to remember me for that, and I'm going to keep stepping up. How do you see that?
Yeah. So in short, what I'd like to do is two things: build a community of people who want to make some kind of impact in this world. In my world, that's usually through entrepreneurship. That usually they're trying to build a business of some kind. And I really want to build a community around that and teach people how better conversations is a major contributing factor to the success that they're going to yield in whatever endeavor they're involved in. That's one piece. The second piece is I see myself as somebody who will be remembered for helping people, being a guide along the way for people in a way that they absolutely believe that they did it by themselves, which is a terrible business model, because if people believe that they did it by themselves, they also think you have no value or little value, right? But I really believe that in deciding to enter into the helping profession, which is coaching, you have to find a way to be a light touch and high impact. So for me, if I'm able to do that, if somebody says, hey, he had light touch, but boy, did he have an impact on me, I'd be happy. I'd be like, I made a difference. Like, I'd be really happy in that. And coaching people through their own, usually entrepreneurial journeys, I think that's where I'd like to see myself. And people say that about me. That's the identifier, because I already think I'm there. That's what I'm working hard to do. And I also believe that, so this is a tricky thing in the coaching world. We were talking about this before, but in the coaching world, there are people who believe that everybody has you have the capacity for your future within you. I'm at the Capital Group, we don't support that. We think there are times when we need to educate you, and then there are times we need to coach you. And it's a blending of those two worlds that's extremely powerful. That if there are things that you just don't know, you don't know how to do, because nobody's ever taught you, you don't have this inside of you. And I think there's a little bit too much of a pragmatic kind of approach in the coaching world where don't give advice, don't teach, etc.
Yeah.
People have the answers within them. I quite frankly think that's nonsense. But but in a way, I think we need to go to a place where, hey, let's teach each other things, and even how do we create what I call upside down learning? So how we talk about that usually is you got a teacher at the top and people are learning below. How do you flip that where we're all learning from each other? So when I was at the University of Toronto, we did this thing where we did a study, and the conclusion we came to was the most underutilized resource in the classroom is a student. And I brought that philosophy with me in everything we do. The most underutilized resource in a company is the employee. The most underutilized resource in a workshop is a participant. The most underutilized resource on a mobile app is the user, right? And if you take that philosophy, I think it goes really, really far. It's really powerful.
Yeah, but one of the things I heard is quite a lot of important points you made there, of which I agree with all of them, because I think it can't be coaching alone in its purest form. There's got to be some teaching, development, guiding people onto a path, showing them, some of the way, because no one knows it all. But one thing I did hear there, Keita, was, the light touch through guiding the person, but then the high impact through the conversation.
Oh yeah, 100%, yeah.
And that's somewhere where I think that's what you're really trying to bring to the table is, at the end of the day, a high impact conversation. That would be that then leads to change.
Yeah, 100%. Like you did a good summary of me there.
Yeah, so we'll keep working on that. And I just want, so just as we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to say to our audience as a tip on something, on anything, to read something, do something, be something?
Okay, well, hopefully they can read my book in about a year or so when it comes out. But I think the tip that I want to give most people is that when you're having conversations, instead of focusing on changing people's mind, focus on planting a seed. Planting the seed of change. But here's the trick. You first have to plant the seed in yourself, because the change starts there first. And too many of us, especially as we go up the corporate ladder and become more successful, we point at everybody else who needs to change.
Yeah.
Start the change from inside. So my thing is plant the seed, but start the planting on your own self. So that would be my advice and sort of takeaway from today's conversation.
No, that's great. So thank you, Keita. This has been a wonderfully rich conversation and high impact for me. I've walked away with quite a lot from this. So I really appreciate you spending this time with me and having this conversation.
Oh, no problem, my friend. Always looking forward to seeing you soon. We're going to be seeing each other soon, so looking forward to that.
Perfect.